All right, we're live, so let me turn the camera around so that Jen can see the students. Okay.
Hi, everybody.
All right. So we have episode 2 of Introduction to Asian/Asian American Studies at Miami University. And last week we had Tad Nakamura and Karen Hana talking about the legacies and challenges of the Asian American movement. Where are you trying to go, David? Trying to get out of the shot? Okay, that's fine. And so this week we talked about the emergence of Asian American writers and artists in the wake of the Asian American movement, and their attempt to quote from Chris Ajima, to sing a song for themselves, right? But with that emerged certain tensions, conflicts, different versions on what it meant to create an Asian American artistic space, right, in this moment of sudden visibility, and that coalesced, crystallized within the ongoing feud between Frank Chin and Maxine Hong Kingston, specifically around representations of Asian American men, Asian American masculinity, and we had a great discussion on Wednesday, especially in regards to how questions over masculinity take place here at Miami University. Right? We talked about George Will's lecture here at Miami University and the different kinds of masculinities that we can reimagine and redefine. So that's why I'm really excited to have
I lost you guys.
a self-defined nerd, scientist. I believe are you based at Yale?
Yes, I am.
Okay, and what kind of work are you doing there, Jen?
I'm actually, in my day job, I'm a scientist, a developmental vascular biologist, so I don't have any sort of formal training in ethnic studies, sociology, so everything that I've been doing has been through my blog, which I've been doing for the last 12 years or so. Okay,
great. So you've got a lot of different skills and talents that you can offer us today. So, so the students read your blog piece that you wrote last year, immediately after the UC Santa Barbara shooting, which talked about the persistence and pervasiveness of this toxic kind of masculinity, right, that shaped the life of Elliot Rogers, who was the shooter in the UC Santa Barbara massacre, and the overall climate of what you call misogyny.
Yes.
That I think we can think about, or I would like for us to think about and talk about in relation to the feud between Frank Chin and Maxine Hong Kingston, and this desire to create a cultural nationalist space and a sort of reinvestment in dominant forms of masculinity. So, first off, can you do you want to talk a little bit about your piece? Why you decided to write it, and what it means to you 1 year later, in the wake of other forms of sort of misogyny, anti-women violence. What is that, Gamergate?
Yes.
Has been in the news recently.
Yes.
So if you wanted to touch on some of those points.
Yeah, sure. So I decided to write the post. There's a part of just the Isla Vista shooting had just happened, and it was in the news, and there was a lot of conversation about Elliot Rodger as a white man. And I felt obligated to sort of read a little bit more about him to really understand what he was thinking when he engaged in those really heinous acts. And so I went and downloaded his manifesto, and I was actually, I would plan to write something about it, but I really held off on writing anything for about a week and a half until I read his full manifesto and really tried to understand at least how he was expressing himself and what he felt was his necessarily why he committed the awful crimes, but really what motivated him in his life, what lens he was looking at the world through. And one of the really important things that I sort of found in the manifesto was that, first of all, I felt that the media had really sort of glossed over his racial identity. He was actually very complicated in terms of his racial identity. He did identify somewhat as biracial, and biracial Asian American, and that was almost completely lost in mainstream coverage. And secondly, he had what I thought was an extremely toxic, but a toxic extreme version of what feminists or women's studies majors would call hegemonic masculinity. And the thing was that it was as if he had internalized what was sort of our prevailing masculine identities, and then it had become twisted and re-expressed in this much more violent manner. But the underlying masculinity that seemed to motivate him was one that I felt was very prevailing and yet rarely interrogated when it came to writers and people thinking specifically about that incident, but more in general. And so I coined this term misogyninity because one of the really striking things about what I read in Elliot Rodgers's manifesto was this idea that masculinity was defined for him by how he saw himself, but really in relationship to women, and how he would be able to whether or not he was able to appropriate or objectify women and conquer them sexually. And he felt as if he was lacking in his own masculinity relative to how he was able to appropriate female sexuality. And that lack of those relationships, he felt, meant that he was not masculine enough. And this was really interesting to me because this is a similar sort of attitude that I felt was pervasive in, or at least an undercurrent in the Frank Chin, Maxine Hong Kingston debate of now several decades ago. And is still, I think, an undercurrent in how Asian American men try to define and frame their masculinity. And I think it's something that a lot of people of color, men of color, sort of have to think about, which is how do we position masculinity relative to this overarching, what women's studies people would call hegemonic masculinity, because it has issues of race and gender both intertwined into the sort of our prevalent ideas of masculinity. And men of color, whether they're Asian American or any other people of color, are struggling to define a masculinity even though the only terms we have are its relation to whiteness. And so I think in the Asian American community, we've had this sort of tension between how to define Asian American masculinity given prevailing emasculation stereotypes, yet the only way we can conceive about our Asian American masculinity is in relationship to this highly sexist prevailing masculine identity that we rarely challenge. And so I sort of coined this term to really address how we think about masculinity relative to masculinity, and then to end the piece, perhaps to think about non-conventional ways to challenge traditional masculinity and find a way to separate it from the implicit misogyny that the sort of overarching hegemonic masculinity depends upon. And I think, Terry, you brought in Gamergate, and I think that's an incredibly great, more contemporary example of how the sort of internalized, institutionalized masculinity that we sort of all live in and live under right now, how that has very misogynistic and sexist overtones that, when they're allowed to go unchecked, can become expressed in a way that's extremely violent towards women. And so I think that we're long overdue as a society to have a conversation about how we define masculinity, both in the mainstream and particularly in communities of color. And that was really sort of the impetus of the post, was to ask the question as to whether or not we weren't thinking outside of the box enough when it comes to wanting to reclaim masculinity for Asian American men.
Yeah, and for those of my students, and if we have any viewers, we do. We have one viewer who are tuning in. Can you briefly recap what is Gamergate? Yeah.
Sure. Well, Gamergate is an extremely convoluted, complex thing that's happening on Twitter right now within the gaming community. Basically, The starting incidents aren't really important, but in essence, a bunch of gamers, very extreme fringe gamers, and I really think that we need to emphasize that this is a very small vocal minority, have come together on the internet to create what almost is a coordinated movement against female gamers, centered around questions of whether or not female gamers are authentically gamers enough, whether or not female gamers who are questioning the gaming community's relationship to feminism and women and sexism, whether or not that's an attack on gaming itself, and really how we treat non-white, non-male others within a specific community. So in Gamergate, it's become sort of a norm of sexual harassment, violence, terrorist threats that has been happening from this small vocal minority towards female gamers or journalists. But the larger question is, why has this been allowed to happen in the gaming community? And this has been happening ongoing for the last year. And how can we stop it? And how can we stop it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think it's definitely important to keep in mind that questions of toxic forms of masculinity are not restricted to the Asian American community, but to multiple communities, and and to think about ways in which certain mediums, certain cultural practices may exacerbate these toxic forms of masculinity, or what you call misogyny.
Mm-hmm.
Speaking of threats of violence, which I believe there was a journalist, a gamer journalist at Utah State, where she was giving,
right.
Or she was supposed to give a talk at Utah State University. Right. Then there was a threat of a bomb scare. That
sort of. Do you want me to give the quick recap?
Sure.
Yeah, so Anita Sarkeesian is a feminist critic and journalist and writer who had decided to create a series of podcasts on the gaming community, really looking at how women are portrayed in the video game industry. So her sort of spotlight was shone directly on programmers and designers. But gaming fans actually got very upset that she was what they perceived criticizing video games in general. They criticized her for not being sufficiently a gamer, so not authentically a game. And that theme comes up when it comes to toxic masculinity, is this attempt to de-authenticate or women and question their identity within the community. But in any event, so she was going to give a talk. So she's been receiving death threats for upwards of a year over these podcasts. And last 2 weeks ago now, she was one of 2 women who received death threats so severe that the FBI had to be called in. One was Brianna Wu, who is married to an Asian American man, and she's actually Canadian. She received death threats in Boston, strong enough that she actually had to leave her house. And then Anita Sarkeesian was scheduled to give a talk in Utah, but a student anonymously emailed the entire campus, letting them know that if the talk went on, he was going to commit a mass shooting larger than the Islamist Elliot Rodgers shooting, specifically to try and silence her as a woman in the gaming industry. And so when Sarkeesian attempted to contact police, she was told that because this was an open carry campus, that they were not going to be able to do anything about the threat, and so she had to make the decision, and she made the decision finally to not go ahead with the talk, because she was very concerned that this person could enter the auditorium armed and commit a shooting. And the police might be there, but they weren't going to do any sort of like pat downs or metal detectors for audiences going in.
And unfortunately, Miami University is not a stranger to these sorts of threats. The director of Women and Gender Studies here, Anita Manur, who's also affiliated with the Asian/Asian American Studies program, also received some pretty vicious emails as a result of her outspokenness about George Will's lecture here, which took place a couple of days ago. Within this climate of misogyny and cases of sexual assault that have happened this semester and previous to this semester. So to kind of bring it back to your piece and misogyny, its role and place on campuses, whether Miami or UC Santa Barbara or beyond, I was wondering if you wanted to speak a little bit about the sort of responses you received as a result of the piece that you wrote.
Well, I assume that your students had a chance to actually read the link, because one of the nice things about my blog is that I actually have open comments, so I don't have to really tell you guys what kind of commentary I received. They're all right there at the bottom of the post. And I can tell you that they were pretty, there's a large backlash against that post within this small vocal minority of Asian American men, that I was sort of asking them to question how they conceive of their masculinity, and this was perceived by some as threatening, and threatening to identity, and it does become very vile and vicious. I have been the target of online harassment in the past. I think what's really interesting about these examples, like the Isla Vista shooting and the Gamergate and these kinds of very sensationalized headlines, is they're just the top that we actually see. The truth is that women, regardless of our race, regardless of how we're trying to participate on the internet, most of us do deal with this kind of misogynistic harassment just as a part of our existence online. And so what we don't see in the news is the day-to-day sorts of tone and tenor of commentary that we receive that still fit into this misogyny identity, or misogyny idea, which is the idea that part of masculinity is the bringing down of women, that to rise a man's masculinity up and for him to perceive himself as masculine, it comes hand in hand with verbal violence or threats of physical violence against women. And that's sort of the idea that the post is really trying to pick up on. And true to form, when I sort of asked whether or not Asian American men could raise a question about how our ideas of masculinity might be unintentionally reinforcing misogyny and misogyny, there was a lot of dissent, discomfort with that idea among some Asian American men, because it is very fundamental to the questions that Asian American men struggle with. And that's another thing that I hope that was brought up last week a little bit with the Frank Chin, Maxine Hong Kingston debate, is that regardless of what you think about misogyny or sexism, you also have to understand, or I also have to understand, that for Asian American men, this is a very core, central, emotional issue with a lot of questions brought up into it. It's a very important question for them. And so when you try to talk about masculinity, you are really talking about self-identity for them too. So they really need to be part of the debate and really need to be participating in these questions of how they can develop masculinity in a way that is both addressing their interests, but also not tearing down the interests of Asian American women or other women.
And speaking of participation in this debate, I'd like to open up the conversation to my students who have come prepared with questions. So let's hear from you all. What sorts of questions do you have for Jen, or things that came up in the past 20 minutes in regards to some of her comments?
In the blog, it talks about how Elliot Rogers considers himself this magnificent. Do you hear that, or do you want me to read it?
I need you to repeat it. You cut in and out a little bit.
So in your blog, you mentioned how Roger considered himself this magnificent gentleman.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering if you could go into details why.
So I heard the first part. Terry, do you mind repeating it? Because I can actually hear you pretty well.
Yeah, sure, no problem. So Jenna asked what you meant exactly by, or what Elliot Rogers meant by his self-description as a magnificent gentleman.
Mm-hmm.
I think that was the question.
Right. Thank you, Jenna, for your question. Reading through his manifesto, like I said, it was fascinating and disturbing. His real world view was that he was a poised, well manicured man, and that he thought that he treated women well, that he was very polite to them, very meek, and not entirely assertive about who he was. And on the other side of that, there's conversation from people who knew him well that knew that he was very, very socially awkward and didn't always put himself out there, and he might have been on the spectrum of autism. So, from his perspective, he felt that he put himself out there and was very kind to women that caught his eye, and that's his perspective on how he approached women. But he felt the term magnificent gentleman was actually pretty key to him, because he felt that this behavior entitled him to women in a way that I think is really central to his motivations. It was not simply that he treated women well, or he treated women in the way that he thought he was supposed to in order to be successful in dating, but he felt that it was a sort of a reciprocation, that if he is a gentleman to women, women should throw themselves at him, and that it should be easy for him to have a girlfriend. And the fact that he felt that he was putting himself out there in the way that he thought was most appropriate, and that he didn't have women basically approaching him to be like, wow, you are such a gentleman, I really want to date you, he felt was a betrayal of what he thought was the sort of social sexual contract, that he was doing what he was supposed to do, and the women instead, he felt, were shunning him in favor of men who he felt were more aggressive, more assertive, and maybe he felt not deserving of this attention. And so throughout his manifesto, he described himself as sort of this prize that women should have been chasing, and because he didn't get that reciprocation, he felt very angry. So it's really like this entitlement complex kind of thing. I don't know if you guys have really talked about that. That's a little bit more jargony a term, but he felt entitled to female sexuality and sexual conquest, and the lack of access to that he felt was a blow to his masculinity. And so the other aspect of that was, we can question how much of a chivalrous gentleman he really was, because at the same time that he said, I would treat a woman very well, I would take care of her and all of this stuff, he also treated women and sexuality as this prize for him to win in order to establish his own masculinity. So it wasn't really about the girl. It wasn't really about finding a partner or a mate. It was about having the girlfriend I'm supposed to have to prove how much of a man and how much of a gentleman I really am. So there's a lot wrapped up in that little term, and it's good that you picked that up, Gemma.
And I thought you did a brilliant job of unpacking the ways in which that entitlement complex was shaped by his possessive investment in white supremacy,
mm-hmm.
and was complicated by his own complicated relationship with this mixed race Asian identity.
Yeah.
And in this class, we've talked about the early Chinese immigrant experience and the emergence of bachelor communities,
mm-hmm.
and the emergence of this popular, asexualized, feminized Chinese immigrant figure that
mm-hmm.
Looms over and haunts Asian American men such as Elliot Rogers, possibly Frank Chin, well, definitely Frank Chin, and how that have reinforced this this desire and investment in inhabiting a dominant masculinity, or what we coin misogyny. Yeah, are there any other questions? Chipper? Was that?
Yeah.
Okay.
In your blog, you referenced another blog writer, I believe, who's kind of talking about another version of masculinity without kind of this need for conquest and domination and that kind of stuff,
mm-hmm.
and referencing instead like love, duty, and honor.
Mm-hmm.
But aren't those less things for just men to appeal to, but more just for everyone? Isn't masculinity, by being defined from its otherness or femininity, isn't it by definition a misogynistic concept? Like, regardless of how you spin it, and should we just try to go for ideals that are worthy of humans as opposed to different ones for men?
And what was your name?
Chipper.
I heard Jiffer, which I know is not right.
Oh, it's Chipper.
Chipper, okay. That's actually a really phenomenal question, Chipper, and that is in the comments actually a little bit too. Somebody actually raises that same point, and on that point, I have an opinion, but I actually don't think I have like the opinion. And this is where I really was hoping to invite other men and women, particularly men and women of color, to really talk about masculinity, because that's a really important issue. Like, that gets really right down to what do we mean when we say the word masculinity. I think what you're trying.
Oh, yeah, sorry, you broke up for about 15 seconds.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I was just saying that I think that it's a really great question, because it really gets right down to the core of what we mean by the word masculinity. I think what you're trying to get at a little bit is it masculinity by definition our identity relative to the other gender? So it always has to be in relationship to women and sexuality. And I would argue, does it really have to be? For example, just the first criticism with that sort of positioning is that it excludes automatically people who are genderqueer, perhaps, or people who are homosexual, who are clearly still able to embody traits of masculinity, who have a self-defined masculinity. But if we limit our ideas of masculinity only to the way that men relate with women or women relate with men, we are by definition excluding people whose gender and sexuality are not related to heterosexuality, as well as gender normativeness. So that's one issue that we can think about. And then in terms of whether or not the traits that I defined as masculinity, like love, honor, duty, whether or not those have to be exclusively masculine or limited to the male sphere, I actually also don't agree with that. Like, a person who is feminine might also have similar love, duty, honor being part of how we define ourselves. So maybe what we really need to be moving towards is to be having ideas of femininity and masculinity that are less polar, because that's part of it, right? Like, we think about femininity and masculinity as if they must be polar opposites. But if we do that, we implicitly say that if a guy is supposed to be aggressive and strong, then in order for that to be a definition of masculinity in a framework where they're two opposite poles, a woman must be meek and submissive in order to embody femininity. And that's very limiting towards how men and women can have relationships with our own gender and our own sexuality. So maybe what we need to be doing is asking the question of, can we create ideas of masculinity and femininity that don't have to be polar opposites of each other and to play off of each other, that a person's masculinity can be defined entirely by themselves without having to be in relationship to someone else. And like I said, I don't have the answer. That's just sort of my thought. And part of the piece was to invite other people to sort of tackle that question and see whether or not they agreed or disagreed. And so, Chipper, your point is completely dead on, and I take it well. Like, that's the opposite thing. It requires a really radical change in how we perceive ourselves, and maybe it's something that we can't do.
Yeah, thank you for Chipper for that question and for your response, Jen. And I think in this class, or maybe my other class, we've talked. Or we've discussed a couple of examples of Asian American men who may offer this sort of non-normative masculinity that's not rooted in sexual conquest, the conquest of women's bodies or resources, territory that is also rooted in the project of Western Empire, but figures like Bruce Lee, maybe Jeremy Lin, both are very highly visible examples, but I'm sure there are many examples of Asian American men who depart from this misogynistic framework of masculinity and instead reimagine alternative masculinities that may be based on love and care for others. There are great films, Bruce Lee films, in which he protects a whole village from the Japanese Empire, or Jeremy Lin. Really inhabiting this role of a point guard and what it means to share the ball. Right? These other sort of microcosmic examples of crafting non-normative forms of masculinity. So
So, I mean, what we're really getting at, the central question is how, as Asian Americans go from this position where we have very few and very limited ideas of ourselves that are really defined and bounded by our stereotypes, how we can move towards more broader and more diverse ideas about masculinity. And that's going to bring into it all of these more non-normative ideas of masculinity. So I feel like this is really the great time to be having this conversation because we're sort of in a position where we're starting to come into ourselves as a community. And so we really need to be thinking very carefully about the kinds of identities that we're gonna start to be able to embody.
Sorry, Jen, we just lost you again for about the past 10, 15 seconds. If you could repeat.
Oh,
Sorry,
okay.
yeah.
I sounded so smart too. No, I was basically just saying that you guys talked about the history of Asian American men and the bachelor societies, and it's very interesting if we track the history of Asian American men and their relationship to their sexuality. It sort of oscillates from two extremes. I don't know if you guys covered the sort of parallel narrative within the white media at the time, which was Asian American men as sexual predators, yeah. So the emasculation thing is sort of a more contemporary reaction to that. Mm-hmm. But either way, men, Asian American men and men of color in general, and gay men and men who are just sort of like not part of the mainstream, have for a long time inhabited very rigid, very defined roles that are defined largely by the stereotypes that they face and endure. And I think that as we have this proliferation of media and this capacity to diversify who we are in the media, these are the questions that we really need to be asking, because we're going to go from these very stereotypical ideas of who we are to a sudden diversification of the kinds of identities and what it really means to be Asian American. And really the central question that I'm getting at is maybe there doesn't need to be one way to be an Asian American guy. Maybe there's many different ways that we can embody masculinity. And if we're in this position where we can start to do that, the questions we need to be raising are things like, if we can have a different masculinity and a broader range of masculinity, how can we start to shape that masculinity that we're going to be building in a way that includes all Asian Americans and not just straight Asian American men.
Mm-hmm. And I think this discussion is really valuable, not just here in this class or within the context of Asian American studies, but especially here at Miami University. So again, we've been making connections between this week's themes on masculinity and masculinity here at Miami University. And I've had several students, both from this class and my other morning class, talk about the sort of typical Miami man and how that corresponds to the sort of toxic or misogynistic form of masculinity that you've discussed. Mm-hmm. So I think this discussion, again, is really, really valuable, especially now in the wake of George Will's visit and some of the protests in the face of his visit. So I want to throw it back to the class. We still have plenty of time for questions for Jen. Jen.
I guess you could say I got a little bit of a beef with Elliot Roger. It occurs to me, because actually when this happened, me and my girlfriend were talking about this, that this really is just another stain on the subculture of like Papas and like just colored people in general in the U.S. because I don't really think it's the issue of Mr. West's narrative, but it's reflective of the ugliness of his personal character. But the interesting thing is that a lot of people subscribe to this idea of like hegemonic masculinity, and so I think the core question is, what causes us to objectify each other as a vehicle of pleasure and leads to a disconnect in what should be an intimate bond and making it a commodity. And then, to follow that up, there's all this talk about, how can you be masculine, or like, what place does femininity have in a man's life? How can a man be strong in an avenue outside of physicality? Because in my mind, there are other avenues, but like, they seem to be marginalized. Like, what about art? What about performance and literature? But our society doesn't value that. So, I guess to reiterate, what causes us to objectify each other, and then how can, as we as men, be strong outside of physicality?
Did you get that, Jen?
I got it. It was such a great comment. So I can talk a little bit, I think, about how the power. I think what it really comes down to is power, and it comes down to racialized and genderized power. I mean, we are growing up, or we exist within a very patriarchal system, and all that really means is that traditionally men have privilege and have maintained privilege over women, and have created a society where there's just by tradition, by history, by the way that we interact with each other, it all reinforces the system in order to reinforce power. We see that across the board in all different kinds of systems, and it's not really surprising that that would be the way things work here. Intertwined with that is a similar sort of racial system where white privilege maintains itself through tradition, through history, through law, in order to maintain its own power over other people. So it really comes down to, why do we objectify each other? This is the sort of micro-level manifestation of the larger system of white male power that was established pretty much, way before any of us were around, and that just sustains itself over time. And so we internalize that, we grow up in that. That's part of how we view the world, and so we reinforce that and express that to one another. So men, to have power, they are taught that they should try to embody a masculinity that is defined by the objectification and commodification of women. And by defining it that way, it establishes power of men over women in order to reinforce this kind of system of privilege. That's not to say that men are the villain, like individual men or individual women. That's to point out that we all live within this system, and that the system itself, in order to dismantle it, we just need to be starting to interrogate and challenge how this system that we're all living in, how that really is built and how it operates, and how it maintains power of some over others. So I think your second question was trying to, again, broaden our ideas of masculinity, and I mean, that's basically, in a nutshell, what this whole thing is really about. I mean, I'm talking about masculinity and misogyny through the lens of Asian Americans. That's my personal view, and I think it's an interesting lens to look at, because in the context of men and power, and masculinity being the tool with which male privilege reinforces power of men over women, Asian American men are interesting because the sexual stereotypes that they currently endure, to some extent, undermine their access to that power and their privilege. I would argue they still have some male privilege, but they would argue that because of the emasculation stereotypes, their access to it is far less than other men. And so to really look at this question through an Asian American lens is really fascinating, because really for them it's about trying to gain access to the power of male privilege. And that's why I think within our community you see a much more extreme, heightened expression of the commodification of women, because for them it's something that they feel that they've been denied and that they feel entitled to. And again, bringing it back to the Gamergate that we've been talking about, I think it's another situation where the men of that community feel generally that they have a lack of access to that power and that privilege just over the social position that they have, and the cultures, the specific subculture that they're in. And so the reaction to that is a very extreme, very hyper-masculine definition of masculinity in order to try and claim that male privilege. So did that make sense? Did that sort of answer your question? A little bit? A little bit?
Yeah, that was a great response and a great question. Yeah, and just again to reiterate the ways in which so-called nerd masculinities, Asian American masculinities, any kind of masculinity that is based on lack or failure, or a lack, an inaccess to misogyny or hegemonic masculinity, can in some ways be even more violent and more vicious, right? As we've seen with Elliot Rogers, with Gamergate, many other examples. And what you said also made me think of a question that I brought up at the end of our last class, which is there a way in which we can imagine Frank Chin and Maxine Hong Kingston and what they represent and their concerns and their critiques together, have them sit down at a coffee table, and what would it mean for them to write in their histories, their positionalities, in a way that doesn't reinforce structural violences based on class or gender, but that can reimagine a different kind of Asian American community that is divested of these legacies of violence. Yeah, so anyway, are there questions from the class? We still have about 5 more minutes, 6 more minutes.
I do want to say that having Frank Chin and Maxine Hong Kingston sit at a coffee table together would be awesome, and I would totally go see that.
Yeah, me too. I'm sure many would. Yeah, I wonder if they've actually met. I mean, it's such a small circle of Asian American writers, especially from that generation. So, but Andy, is that a hand?
It's not a really great question, but I kind of want to get your opinion on what you think of John Cho, who's recently portrayed Andrew Sulu in Star Trek. American actors to be taking a TV series as the investigator. I'm curious what you think what your opinion is on how he's affecting Asian American masculinity, especially in there's reinforcing the side of where if you think it's taking away from that, it's reshaping it. If you think it's changing.
Did you get that, Jen?
I caught the question and then missed all of the discussion, but I think I understand what you were saying. So first of all, there are no stupid questions, and that's actually a really good one. So for those of you who don't know John Cho, he played Sulu in Star Trek. He played Harold in Harold and Kumar. I know him from Better Luck Tomorrow, which hopefully you guys will touch up at some point in this class. But so John Cho is in a sitcom right now called Selfie, where he is playing basically a Henry Higgins character to an Eliza Doolittle character in an updated My Fair Lady. And
sorry, Jen, we just lost you. I'm sure you said something else that was brilliant,
No.
but you just lost you for 10 seconds.
Yeah, no worries. I actually could tell. So I was going to say there are no stupid questions, and it's actually a good one. John Cho basically is a Korean-American actor who's risen to a huge amount of prominence right now as Sulu in the Star Trek films. He's also known as Harold in the Harold and Kumar films, and he's also currently playing a Henry Higgins character in Selfie, which is a sitcom where he plays opposite a British actress who's playing an Eliza Doolittle character. And I think the question you were asking is whether or not I think that he challenges Asian American masculinity in a way, and I do. I actually think he does, but not necessarily in Selfie. I think that John Cho is a really phenomenal actor and a really great person as well. And the thing I have, my issue with Selfie, though, we've been talking about masculinity relative to whether or not it needs to be the conquest of a woman or successfully bedding a woman, basically. And in Selfie, if you look at the framework of that show, he's playing a largely asocial and somewhat emasculated character as an Asian American, so kind of pulling on the Asian American stereotype of the man a little bit as someone who lacks in the sexuality department. He lacks in basic emotional humanity as well. And the sort of plot of the show, as we perceive it, is that over time he's going to come into himself as a more masculine man as he has a relationship with the Eliza Doolittle character. And so his masculinity is going to be tied with his budding romance with a woman. And so in many ways that is reinforcing the same idea that Elliot Rodger felt, which is that masculinity is innately dependent upon successfully being with a woman. The hotter the woman, the better. And not being with a woman creates a certain level of amasculinity or non-masculinity. And that's the starting point of that show. Now, whether or not they tackle that directly is a good question. On the other hand, John Cho is playing for the first time a romantic lead. And so for Asian American men, this has been really pioneering because for the first time they're being seen as sexualized at all. And so, but I would argue that if we are looking at non-conventional masculinity, I'm less impressed by the selfie character, even though he will, for the first time in really the history of Asian American men in film, have an opportunity to play a romantic lead as his the primary point of being on the film. But if you look at the rest of his work, his character as Sulu, and also his character as Harold, and going all the way back to where he first got his start in film, which was Justin Lin's independent film Better Luck Tomorrow. I think in many of those other films, he portrays a strong, assertive, funny guy whom you could completely see as a sexual lead and a romantic lead. But that's not quintessential to his masculine identity. So it's been divorced. His masculinity is divorced from his sexuality in those characters. And while I'm not saying that Asian American men should not be sexual on film, I do think that we should give credit to his earlier work, where I think he was starting to really push against the boundaries of what we think of masculinity and Asian American masculinity, and being able to do it without having to link it directly with women and sort of the misogynistic implications of his masculinity being centrally defined by the woman that he's around. And in terms of other Asian American men to watch, in terms of really changing the way that masculinity is portrayed in film, I actually really think that Daniel Dae Kim on Hawaii Five-0 is a really great example, because he is embodying a lot of sort of conventional masculine traits, but also breaking out of those boundaries by being an intelligent, physical, and tactical character whose masculinity is defined not only by his relationship with his wife, who I'm not going to tell you guys what happens in the show, but also by his relationship with the other characters around him, his sort of sibling-like character with the sibling-like relationship with Grace Park, and he's clearly a sexualized character, but that's not central to how his masculinity is defined on that show. So for me, that's sort of the better one to be watching, because I think that it's really sort of playing with these ideas of what it means for Daniel Dae Kim's character, Chin Ho Kelly, to be seen as the masculine character on that show, and really to do it in a context where you've got two white leads, and yet I think he's really the masculine character on that show.
Interesting. Yeah, I haven't really watched the show.
Not a lot of people are anymore.
That's too bad. And yeah, I heard the selfie can make it cancel, so we may not even see how that relationship and John Cho's character develops. So we have about 30 seconds left. If you want to give any sort of parting words to my students and to our one viewer from outside the class about masculinity, or about your own work and identity as an Asian American feminist blogger, scientist, nerd, etc.
Yeah. So I just had a chance to talk to some students yesterday at Berkeley about this too. I really think that these kinds of settings are really critical. Being able to interact with students who are asking these questions, like, it's not really important what I do, because I'm just sort of a person thinking ideas and questions and trying to start a conversation. And really, it's in these classes where you guys are having the conversations that I think are important. So I really thank you guys for taking some time to chat with me about these, and to really emphasize that it's what's happening in your classroom that is the future of all of identity politics, whether it's the Asian American identity, or larger questions of masculinity, or larger questions of race and gender. It's really you guys and what you guys think that really matters. So I really want to thank you guys for taking some time to listen to me, and I'm really thankful to you guys for giving me a chance to listen to you. So thanks.
All right, let's thank Jen for her insight and brilliance. We're really lucky to have you, and hopefully you've gained some new followers for your blog. Yeah, and thanks once again, Jen.
Thank you. Take care, guys.
Take care. All right. Oops.